Hey everyone, I'm Tammy Salenberger, the author of The One Inside, 30 Days to Your Authentic Self. This podcast is for anyone curious about who they are, the different parts of themselves, and for those who want to connect with their true self. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I am super excited today to talk to Steffi Bednarek. Steffi is an author, a consultant, a speaker, and I like this term. She's a climate psychologist, or she's into climate psychology. Is that more what I would say?
I call myself a climate psychology consultant. So yeah. Okay. Whatever that is.
Whatever that means. Yes. And she has a new book out called Climate Psychology and Change. So I'm super excited to talk to you, Steffi, about this super important topic. And so welcome to the podcast. And why don't we start where we always start, which is where you are in the world and what you would see if you look out your nearest window.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And so the accent you hear is German. I was born in Germany, but I lived in the UK for 25 years, actually 26 years. And I'm looking out onto a very rainy sort of early evening. It's cold. I think it's 15 degrees. It's supposed to be summer. And so there's climate change right there. We haven't had much warmth yet, and I even pondered whether I should just for a moment switch the heating on because it's quite cold.
So, Steffi, for you, and there's a part of me that's like, I'm going to ask a million stupid questions, but for you, are you aware of climate change every day?
Kind of in the background, I suppose, yes. It's not like I sit there and actively sort of think about it. I don't just see climate change as the weather or an excess of CO2 in the atmosphere. In terms of what I do as a climate psychologist, I see climate change as an unintended consequence of a certain kind of mindset. So in that sense, I see it in everything. And that's what the book is about, that climate change is in the buildings that we inhabit. It's in the way we go about our daily business. It's in our relationships, in the way we think about ourselves, in the way we relate to others, in the way we parent, in the way our economy works, in our education system. So it's much more like it's something that is in the fabric of everything. And that nobody really intended. So in that sense, yes, I do think about it every day.
So could you give me or give us some examples of that? Like the mindset, it almost thinks, I was thinking about if we kind of throw some IFS into this, that like, I was just thinking, is it managers that have sort of a mindset, or is it sort of, it's more like a legacy burden, like the sort of a legacy burden mindset that we all have? And I guess I'm curious about that. Like what kind of mindsets you're talking about?
So as far as I'm concerned, from an IFS perspective, I think it's in the whole system that you have manager parts and their job is to help us adapt to the culture we live in. And so they have to internalize the culture. So IFS fits perfectly with a general living systems perspective and an ecological perspective of life. It's impossible to live within a culture and to be outside of it. So the manager's job is to make us fit in an individualistic culture, to make us think as individuals rather than a collective, to zoom in on the specific rather than to see the whole, to think in terms of what's a successful life, to think in terms of money, in terms of status, in terms of power. So I think the managers take that on. And then often in our profession as psychotherapists, I think we become part of that by just applying for instance, trauma therapy to the person and not zooming out as well and seeing how the person actually and some of their parts are actually cultural and collective. How it's not just my part, how certain manager parts are shared, and that certain exiles are not, that it's not a personal decision to have certain kinds of exiles or to exile certain parts of me. It's the price I have to pay in order to fit into a certain culture.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so when we think about climate change or a mindset, can you give me some examples of what that might look like?
What a mindset looks like, that kind of.
Yeah, like my individual mindset that I might have, like like it's easier for me to buy, and this is just sort of a simple example that I think of, but it's sort of easier for me to buy bottles of water, right? Plastic bottles of water, easier for me to buy them. Then I always have fresh, cold drinking water. And it's just easier for me to do that. It's easier for me to, I feel like I make this choice every single day. Like it's easier for me to grab a Ziploc baggie and put my son's carrots in the Ziploc baggie than root for the Tupperware drawer. Like stuff like that I know are just kind of silly. I feel like silly examples to me, but and like everybody else is doing it. And so I guess I'm thinking of that. Like when you talk about climate change being a mindset and the mindset being sort of individual, kind of an individual, either consumerism or sort of like what's easiest, quickest, most efficient for me in this moment.
Yeah, and again, already you're describing quite a system there. So there's a part that knows, it would be better for, we can love our children and feel like I want the best for them. And so there's a part that knows that if I don't start making drastic changes, that will really dramatically impact on the well-being and the health and the life expectancy of our children. And then there's another part, and that may be a firefighter part that goes, whoa, that's, I don't even want to think about that. And so comes in and distracts, or comes in and says, look, everybody else is doing it. It's fine. Just, or, there's lots of different firefighter parts that may come in and say, it's not as bad. If you listen to this politician, they say climate change isn't even a thing. So surely, it would be okay. Or explanations in terms of there's also a lot of entitlement. It's like, I'm entitled to this. Yes, it would be better not to eat meat, but, and then we find an explanation, or our firefighter parts find an explanation to make it okay. But that doesn't mean that we don't also have parts that feel terrified. Yeah, parts that actually feel a lot of grief. So I think there's a moral injury that we share. Growing up and living in a Western culture, we kind of know that a lot of our day-to-day innocent-seeming rhythms and patterns cause enormous harm somewhere else, either to other human beings that we don't immediately see, or to the more than human world. I think there's hardly a person that doesn't somewhere know that. But we've also learned in the growing up, and having, when I see my daughter as a small child, she really cared, and slowly you learn to care just a little less. A lot of children then say to adults, like, surely we must do something about that. And then when they see the scale of devastation, it just becomes too much. So again, it's really an act of self-preservation for firefighter parts to come in and to say, let's just not think about it. Let's distract ourselves. Let's just have a bit of fun.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I actually can feel that happening inside of me as you're talking. I feel this part of me or something in me feeling like, oh my gosh, like what are we talking about? Like the weather or the plastics or like the polar bears. What's wrong with the polar bears? Like the seals and the straws. I can feel that. And then I can feel this like something else that's like saying, like, well, I don't know. It's not saying that it's not true, but it's sort of it's coming in to try to help that kind
Yeah.
of panicky feeling that I'm feeling right now as you're talking. Yes,
Yeah.
that's what my experience is. And I'm curious if sort of the
Yeah.
listener can just notice their own, just right in, just, 10 minutes in, if they can already notice like what's happening inside their own systems. Is they're like, I mean, we all probably have a little bit of an idea, a different idea or a different, maybe not different, but it, like you said, we all have an experience of what climate change is. And so, whatever that means to them and like kind of as you're talking, kind of what's coming up for them and how they're noticing their system trying to deal with that.
And what I find really interesting is the idea of the collective, because there's a colleague of mine, German colleague, Juliane Appelopper, she's called. And I just had a conversation with her last week, and I really liked what she said, where she said that some trauma is so heavy to carry that one human skin is too little. We need a bigger surface. In that sense, my inquiry around a lot of, so I'm a trauma therapist and I applied trauma theory, including IFS, to the climate crisis. But when I just look at my system, it's almost too confined, it's too zoomed in. And then the question is also, what is it actually we need if the support in my own system or self-led inquiry relationship, is that enough? Or do there need to be several selves coming together in order to meet the enormity of what we're facing? Like, is it too much? Because there's layer upon layer upon layer of trauma there. And yes, it has an individual, always an individual aspect to it. And in our profession, we actually know quite a lot about that individual perspective. What I argue, and so I'm the editor of a book, not the author. There's a lot of other colleagues that argue with me that we have lost the collective perspective on this.
Mm.
We zoomed in too much and stayed zoomed in. So, what are our mechanisms to actually bring healing to a collective culture?
Mm.
So, if a culture's normal is actually death bringing, what do we as psychotherapists and trauma therapists and IFS therapists, what have we got to offer to work with the larger perspective? And so that's an ongoing inquiry for me.
I like the question. I have a part that's like, okay, what's the answer? But I think the question is almost, yeah, it just feels like maybe an important question just to ponder and to sort of just sit with the question. I like what you said. You said that one of the things that you're passionate about, and I think this goes into what you're saying right now, is how personal parts relate to collective parts that we're socialized into by Western society.
When I talk to colleagues about climate change and their individual, personal, private practice, a lot of colleagues say, well, not many people talk about climate change. So my clients just don't talk about it. And so then there's a question about who's responsible for bringing something in. And there's the notion of a collective silence. So where we help each other to exile something that nobody quite knows how to talk about.
Wow. Yeah.
And so there's an elephant outside of the room, and nobody really wants to be responsible for bringing it in. And so we then quite comfortably focus on, and I don't want to dismiss, I really don't want to be dismissive, because it's not instead of personal issues. But sometimes what we focus on with our clients is relatively small in comparison to the magnitude of the future that's coming towards us. But so what are we doing? So the question is not so much people are not talking about it. It's what's our contribution to keeping it out there and focus relatively small wounds in comparison to a massive thing. When we talk about the possibility of extinction of not just human life, but a lot of other life forms, and a kind of normality that will cost our children whatever we think they deserve, or whatever we take for granted now as familiar. All of that is eroded. And so then we have to ask, what's my contribution to a kind of normality that is dangerous? And why don't we talk about it? What would it mean if we knew that a client had cancer and we never talk about it? So that's a question about it. We come to, it challenges our view of ethics as well. And we don't have many issues where the therapist is as involved in a pattern as the client, where we both may share a similar bias. So that's one example, I think, of a collectivity that is hard to even see because we're all steeped in it. We're all part of a certain kind of distraction and disavowal and a certain kind of numbing.
I was just thinking, I wonder if, because my parts are like, silence is great. I am all for that. And I thought, because that's how we handle conflict. We don't. We're like, no, thank you. I'm not handling conflict. So that's why it's so comfortable. So I was like, yeah, because I almost wonder if we think of our individual or our parts or our systems ways of handling conflict or handling stuff that's uncomfortable, that's also how we're handling the climate crisis.
And if the therapist does that too, so then who is enough in self to even inquire about the silence, if that makes sense?
Definitely. Yeah. Right. Because if my parts are in silence, like they're silent about it, then I'm not inquiring. And if they're not inquiring, then we're both just not inquiring. And that feels pretty good. Yeah.
Exactly. And if I'm your client, you take me to your supervisor, and the supervisor is also not inquiring.
Yeah.
And then we go to conferences and read journals, and nobody speaks about it. So something happens at a collective level.
And that happens until what?
Well, that's why I call myself a climate psychologist. And that's a very new area of the psychotherapeutic and psychological profession. And it started about 12 years ago in the UK. And it was a handful of people that kind of said, we kind of need to figure out how we can bring this in. And it was incredibly niche. And now there's a lot of research that goes into that. It starts to be a profession that is worldwide. But also what we're saying is we can't just see it as a psychological issue that is siloed. We have to start talking across boundaries, because it's not just that silence is everywhere. It's in every aspect of life. And if clients don't talk about it in psychotherapy, the psychological aspect of climate change is also not discussed in the news, is also not discussed at COP meetings. And so, but our mindset and the way we cope with the level of trauma will determine elections, will determine who we believe speaks the truth. And that again will change the world that we live in. So actually, I think the psychology of it is incredibly important. And for me, that brings another question about is my work now just with individual clients in private practice? And I answered this with no. And so this is where my work has stepped out of the therapy room and into the world. And look, so I now work with organizations, I work with politicians, I work with journalists, and kind of make it up as we go, because this is a new field. We are in a new situation and we have to figure it out together.
Mm.
And I think IFS is an amazingly important lens for this because people get it. And it helps. So when I work with organizations, and it doesn't help to shame people. So we know as IFS therapists and generally as psychotherapists, that's not how we change. That's not how systems change works either. So we have to inquire in a curious, compassionate, relational way. And I think IFS is a beautiful way to allow people to talk about things that they're ashamed about. Just as we have now about, well, I kind of know that flying isn't great, but I just really want to have a part that really wants to. I have a part that looks away and doesn't want to know. It's so much easier to say, because then I can also say, and I have a part that really wants to do the right thing. And so it allows people to kind of show more, and that's the only way we can start to take care of these managerial parts and kind of get their permission to, that we can work with them, we can see them, we can make them visible. And I think that's absolutely beautiful work, and people really take to it.
That's beautiful. So I love what you're saying, because what I'm hearing you say is you don't have the answers to these things, but you're asking, you're inquiring, and you're inviting an inquiry, and you're inviting the inquiry with the knowledge and sharing the knowledge that we're multiple and people have parts. And so that we can have the inquiry in a safer way that doesn't feel so shaming. So we can have an inquiry around flying and gas and plastics and you said meat earlier. So we can have some inquiry around just some of these topics. And then we can do so in a way that feels a little less shaming, because we can talk about parts. We can talk about parts and yeah, it opens up the conversation. It almost invites more of a collective, like a collective conversation.
Yeah. And so I started to experiment when I work with teams and organizations. I start to experiment a little around. It's a real aha moment, because there's certain things about people that, so there's a self-like parts that come up. It's like, I know what to say. I know what you want to hear. And I adapt in a way that sounds like the real thing, but it's not. And so I think IFS makes that sayable. I sometimes work with people in a playful way where I ask them first to explore certain parts privately, and they don't have to share that. And then people get a bit more courageous. And then we look at people placing themselves in the room and inhabiting certain parts, and then to see, oh my God, I'm not on my own here. You know, there's 10 other people who stand with me. This is a collective thing. Also has something very empowering, and it's freeing up energy. The fact that somebody may be brave to describe something that felt unsayable about a part frees up somebody else who can say, oh, I have that too. And I think that makes this work very powerful.
Yeah, I love that, IFS gives us a way to have hard conversations and then also to have a collective experience that feels a little bit safer. What about other parts? Is there anything else you'd want to say about the parts of us? We talked about the silencing parts and the minimizing parts, and but any other parts that are aware of, that you've heard of or you experience that come up for people when we talk about climate change?
Yes. So one thing that comes up very, very quickly is action. I think it really depends where the action comes from. So which part calls for action or is active? And that makes a huge difference. So talking again about adapting to collective culture in Western culture, and Joseph Henrich from Harvard University and his colleagues, they've coined a term called weird cultures. So that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic cultures are actually the minority of human beings.
Oh.
And what they found is that 96% of all psychological research is based on weird cultures. And a lot of that research, actually, even smaller, is, I think they said something about 70% of the research in psychology focuses on America. But we make statements about the whole of humanity. And so we're losing sight of other cultures that are not westernized in this way. And so we're losing a certain kind of diversity. I think I'm going off track. Can you actually just remind me what you asked me?
Yeah, I asked you about the different parts of us that come up during climate change. And you were talking about those advocacy parts, those like parts that want to be advocates and get really active, and that those can be parts of us and that can potentially be problematic when our advocacy comes from these very driven. I'm putting more words in your mouth. You didn't say this, but
Yes, it's exactly what you say. So thank you for reminding me. So within Western culture, we like action. It's problem, what's the solution, and what's the way from A to B? The shortest, quickest way from A to B. We like linear correctives, but we miss a lot with that. And so so there's this term climate anxiety. And when I listen to really well-intentioned people from other fields, what I hear again and again is, if you feel climate anxiety, what will make you feel better is action. And then we have to ask, what action? Because a lot of scared people just being active is not necessarily going to be regenerative action. Just blind, anxiety-fueled action for action's sake in order not to feel.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that this is helpful at all. It may make me feel better, but that would be action from a firefighter part.
Just thinking that, firefighters would be happy, and we don't usually want to live from that place. But
exactly. And so I can also have managerial action with the clipboard. It's like, come on. I need to measure success. And that's actually, and we see a lot of that. So people are really well-intentioned. They kind of have decided, this is what I'm going to do. And then they burn themselves out. Because climate change is an interconnected problem. It's that there's no direct corrective solution to it. And so sometimes what looks like a solution in one field is actually causing a problem in another field. So we know that, for instance, with electric cars, it sounds like, yeah, that's a really good idea, but the lithium that is needed for those cars is actually causing absolute devastation somewhere else in the world. So I offer mentoring to a lot of change makers. And that's what I see very frequently, that in order not to see that actually a lot of what they do is not that successful at bringing about the change they hope to bring about, they exhaust themselves by just doing more. And so then the action comes from a managerial part.
So that makes a lot of sense, right? There's a part that feels a lot of anxiety. We're calling that climate anxiety. So the firefighter comes in with action plan, get a bunch of people together. Let's all stop using straws. Like, let's do something quick. And obviously that's exhausting because it's that firefighter behavior. And it doesn't really, it kind of masks the anxiety, but doesn't really, it's not self taking care of that anxiety.
Yeah. And so what then my work is with when I work with individual change makers is to help them to unblend from these parts that use action as a tool to not feel.
Wow.
And so, of course, when I then step into self, I have to ask, what do these parts fear would happen if they didn't use action in that way? And then, of course, there's all the exiles behind that. It's like it would be unbearable because I would then see the devastation in the world, or I would feel the moral injury of having to watch that our politicians are not really taking responsible choices, or whatever it is that kind of breaks our hearts. And we would have to tune into that and start to take care of these parts that are terrified or outraged or embarrassed and ashamed about our non-action. But that's when I get to a different form of action, one that can actually start to bear. And sometimes, like talking about, sometimes I also need others. So it's the reaching out to others. And when I can bear to see the situation for what it is, I can also start to see the small openings that present themselves. So that's when I'm not just blindly acting, but I can see, oh, I'm part of the system. And so that's very powerful because my choices either co-create the same toxicity in the system, or I can take slightly different choices, which already bring about different outcomes, different forms of relationships. And so that's where every single person has the choice in almost everything we do, what we nourish and nurture, which part of the system we kind of have agency over. And we're all part of multiple systems all the time.
Wow, that's beautiful. Steffi, we only have a few more minutes. I know there's so much to say. So what else do you feel like is important for people to know? One thing, one thing that you think would be important for them to know.
I guess it's noticing and what exiles there are collectively. Spirituality is one, for instance, that is often exiled from our professional identity. So there's a noticing of how we how we turn up as professionals, what gets exiled on the way from home to work, for instance.
Mm.
And that means as well, so our managerial parts will kind of have a certain opinion of what it means to be professional. But that is often that professional role is hiding the consequences of the actions we take in that professional role. And so my work is asking people, and it doesn't really matter what profession they're in, to pay attention, to bring awareness to what gets exiled in their professional identity. Mm. And so I did some really fun work with architects, for instance, when we looked at what would change if they were mums and dads as architects. Not mums and dads that create buildings and environments that work for children and family, but also for future children and families. How would decisions change if we brought that in? And it's not for me to tell people what to bring in or not, but it's an exploration. And so everybody has agency over that. What is it they want?
That's the thing that you do, Steffi. You ask the questions. You're like, I'm just asking an inquiry. I'm just asking a query. I don't have the answers, but I'm asking the questions that make people sort of really think about. Let me think about that. What am I leaving at my professional door, my office building? Like, what am I leaving at home on the way to my office, or whatever that is, whatever that looks like? Like, you're just asking the question, just as a curious one. The question is meant for curious wondering, which I think is fantastic.
And the list is very long of what we leave out.
That's great. That's really great. Steffi, how can people find out about you? So you have this new book out, which is fantastic. So I recommend people go get your book. But how can they find out more about what you're doing and all you're involved in? And you have so many great workshops and you've written so many articles. Yeah. That's great.
So if people Google me, so Steffi Bednarek, they'll get to my personal website. But also from the book, Climate Psychology and Change, there's a website now. And at the moment, I would like the ideas that are in the book to leave the page and to go into conversation. I think it's really important that it's not just ideas that we find cognitively interesting. They're actually, it's important to have conversations about these ideas and to check how do they live in me. And so at the moment, there's a lot of events where I bring people together to have uncomfortable conversations together. And from that, there will be a whole range of offers, workshops, events that will spring from that. So I think that's a really good website to check out. And also, I want to invite people to be active, to be creative. So if you have an idea, contact me. Like literally, we need to come together to look at, this is an evolutionary step that we need to take together. And it's not written. We don't know the answer. We have to experiment and try something out. So if people have ideas, want to get involved, then please do get in touch. And I'm all up for kind of experimenting together.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So I want to ask you my last question, which is, if you didn't do what you're doing and you had to do something different, what would you do?
I forgot that. Yeah. So I said to my daughter this morning when I drove her to the train station to get to school, funnily enough, she asked me the same question. And I said that if I wasn't a climate psychologist or a psychotherapist, I would want to be a decorator.
Oh.
Because I think it's in what we do, in what I do in both roles, it's so unclear what a day's job has done. You can't really say, this bit is what I did. Yeah, because it's always life. And even if somebody kind of changes and is very complimentary, you can never really know. It's not just ever one thing. But when you decorate, you can look around the room and you can say, that's what I've done today, and it looks very different.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of satisfaction.
That's so funny because think about climate change, not to bring it back to that, but think about climate change. And that's the same thing. There isn't an instant gratification. And it sounds like that's part of one of the difficulties with when our parts are really driven in this way. There's not like, oh, I make this change and then I see a difference. I'm not seeing a difference because it's a lifelong, long journey. So that's so interesting that's it shows up there too.
Yeah. So my parts are craving a bit of like, oh, look, I've done that.
Yeah. I feel that way when I do the dishes. I'm like, this was a mess and now it's done. And I feel really good about it. Check. A+.
Yeah. So if you didn't do what you're doing, you'd be washing up in hotels or something.
Oh, I hope not.
Good.
Steffi, thank you so much. I appreciate this and I appreciate the work you're doing in the world. So thank you.
It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, like, all the things. My book is available at your favorite independent bookstore or all the places books are available. You can also visit my website, tammysallenberger.com, where you can download a free meditation on getting to know your should parts. You know, those parts of you who remind you of what you should be doing. They sound a bit critical at times. Yes, we all have them. You can follow me at IFS Tammy on Instagram and Twitter and the One Inside Facebook page. I'm so grateful for Jack Reardon, who created the new music. Jack is a graduate of Derek Scott's IFS Stepping Stone program. Thanks, Jack, for getting me. And to you, thanks for listening.